This podcast is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks. If you would like to support it, go to audibletrial.com/Sam Harris. Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Well, these podcasts now always seem to start with some housekeeping. This strikes me as a troubling sign, but I don't think I can avoid it in the present case. So my failed podcast with Omer Aziz has come back to haunt me, as I knew it would. Please recall how this whole thing began. Omer Aziz, a Yale law student who few people had ever heard of, wrote a truly vicious and dishonest review of my book with Maajid for Salon. And then he sniped at me on Twitter, and I, in an expansive and quixotic mood, I think bordering on mania, invited him to discuss this review on my podcast. First mistake, right? Imagining that a conversation with an antagonist of this sort is possible. I then spent nearly 4 hours talking to him, and I found that I had invited an immature and smug and extraordinarily petty and fairly paranoid person into my living room to just trash the reputations of serious people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Maajid Nawaz. The fact of the matter is I found Omer to be incapable of having an honest conversation on any of the topics we touched. Now, those of you who thought my conversation with Maryam Namazi was bad may have an inkling of what I'm talking about, but this was actually much worse. So I declined to release the podcast, and I warned him of this possibility in advance. I said if I found the podcast unusable, I wouldn't release it. And now he's complaining in Salon that I have infringed his freedom of speech, if you can believe that. This person is becoming a lawyer at Yale, as though if I'm committed to free speech, I have to give a platform to every belligerent person who doesn't make sense on my podcast. He also claims that the format I proposed for our podcast, where he would read his entire review and we'd talk about it in a very systematic way, that this infringed on his freedom of speech, and that it was a quote, very revealing sign that I was afraid to debate him. Now, let's get clear on this, because Glenn Greenwald and all the other usual suspects have seized upon this as further evidence of my hypocrisy. And Salon even published the private email correspondence I had with Omer, needless to say without my permission, and edited to my disadvantage. And I am sorry to go into these boring details, but hundreds of you have contacted me. Many of you are captivated by this phony controversy. So let me explain what happened here. And I'm going to give you a few clips from the podcast so you can fact-check Omer's article. I invited Omer onto my podcast to discuss his review. The fact that he wrote the review was the only reason I had ever heard of him and the only reason I wanted to talk to him. And I thought this would be a very interesting experiment to see if we could move from a totally uncharitable and intellectually dishonest review to an honest conversation about important issues. This was an experiment in the possibility of conversation from my point of view. Now, Omer seems to think, and Glenn Greenwald and all of these people seem to agree with him, that having him read his review on my podcast put him at some disadvantage. In fact, Omer compared this to a Stalinist show trial. He called it a, quote, bizarre and rather creepy way to structure our conversation, and, quote, a guerrilla attack, where I was, quote, demanding to be judge, jury, and prosecutor. The invitation, he said, was demeaning and one-sided. Then he goes on to write, standing behind one's own work is not the same thing as willingly submitting oneself to a demeaning non-debate dictated by another person. Note the irony here. Harris was lecturing me about, quote, what is wrong with our public conversation, end quote, but was simultaneously and shamelessly outlining an approach that not even the most obscene Fox News anchors had the gall to do. Journalist and attorney friends of mine were stunned at Harris's brazen stacking of the deck. For someone who spends so much time sermonizing about free inquiry, here was Harris deliberately stifling debate, and in a rather disturbing manner at that. Okay, and I'm responding to this because this went off like a nuclear bomb on social media. Here's the relevant portion of the podcast. This is how the conversation started with Omer after a few preliminaries, getting Skype working and all the rest. And you tell me how stifling of debate this sounds to you, how restrictive, how demeaning, how stacking of the deck. Well, I'm talking to you now because of the book review you published in Salon,
That's right,
my favorite website, in which you wrote very critically and dismissively about the book I wrote with Maajid Nawaz, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And so rather than just talk to you about the review in general, I'm going to have you read it out loud on the podcast so that we can discuss it point for point. Now, you've agreed to do this, but under some duress. You told me by email you think this is a terrible idea. But I want our listeners to understand why I've structured the conversation this way. Now, first, you can say anything you want. I mean, I'm simply insisting that you also read every word of your review so that our listeners can hear it and I can respond to it. But you can make any caveats or supporting points you want, and we can talk about anything under the sun. I just want to deal with your review first and pretty systematically. So there's, just to be clear, there's absolutely nothing about this that is closing down debate or conversation. I'm not going to edit anything you say unless you ask me to.
Sure.
So here is why I want to focus on the review. First, it's a very common experience for a person to read a review like this, or even to write one, and to have no idea what the target of this kind of criticism could or would say in response. Because there's simply no good format in which to answer charges like this. And so as an experiment, I want to use my podcast for this, if only just this once. And in particular, I want our listeners to know what it's like, and I want you to know what it's like, for me to read a review like this, actually almost in real time, sentence by sentence. Because it seems to me you can't possibly know how fully this essay of yours misfires from my point of view. I mean, you took the time to write it.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably you think your statements are clear and accurate and that you've built a very damning case against me and Maajid, in particular me. But there's almost no single sentence here that survives scrutiny. And I want to demonstrate this for you.
Yeah, and let me just make a quick point. My initial reservations to doing it in this format, and I highlighted this when you said it's never been done before, and my suggestion that it's never been done before is because this could descend into a kind of Talmudic parsing of, single sentences and words that won't be helpful at all. Now, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and say that's not going to happen. On the second point, I think in an earlier podcast you said that I really hate you or I hate Maajid and I hate you even more, and I want to correct that. I don't hate you and I don't hate Maajid. I find some of your ideas to be repugnant, and I was responding to those. I didn't call you a racist. I didn't call you a bigot at all. I didn't call you any names. I'm merely contending and responding to the ideas that I read in your book. And so that was my intention, at least.
Okay, well, that's fine. And we'll get into what you said specifically and its implications. And again, it's not going to be a rabbinical parsing of every word, but I do want to move through it systematically. And I want to also make clear that my goal isn't to embarrass you, and my goal really isn't even to debate, ultimately. I'm trying to bridge the gap between your essay and the cynicism that it communicates to me and what I would consider a real conversation. But I think doing this is going to take some real work because I think we're very far apart on the page. And obviously, I'm going to cut you some slack because I understand that no one writes an article like this anticipating to then have to read it to its primary target. And I can only assume that even if you kept your opinions about me as they are, you would probably phrase a few of these points differently in the context of an actual conversation. So I think one thing to make clear up front is that your insults don't matter to me. I don't take anything you've written personally.
Good, you shouldn't.
The problem is I don't take anything you've written to heart at all because it's as though you're writing from another universe here. So, and this is what I find so troubling, and this is why I want to have this conversation. So the problem for me in general, just to step back before we get into the text here, is that I understand Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi better than you understand me and Maajid. And I can actually say this with certainty because you are absolutely wrong about me and Maajid. And I could ascribe beliefs to al-Baghdadi at random and do a better job than you've done here. I could throw the I Ching and come to a better understanding of his motives then you have come to an understanding of ours by reading and reviewing our book.
The only thing I want to say to that is I think I understand Big Daddy better than you and Maajid understand Big Daddy, because I actually factor in to account his political strategy, his geostrategic policy that he's had in Syria and in Iraq that's allowed al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq, to go from being a ragtag group of rebels that was decimated in 2011 to be this very powerful militia in 2016. And that, like, the political factors, and I hope we get to them, those are things that you and Maajid don't discuss. I don't see you taking an interest in.
Okay, but that's a totally separate point. I mean, whether you understand Baghdadi better than I do, we can discuss. I'm saying that I understand him, this person who is practically infinitely distant from me on the moral and political and religious and intellectual spectrum, better than you understand me and Maajid, and we have told you our motives for writing this book, right? So that's what I find so strange here.
Sam, I don't care about your motives, though. I don't like. For me, it's what the book says, right? And what you said before.
You describe, what we're going to get into is because one of the things I'm going to take issue with very early on in your review is your ascription of motives to us. But again, let me just step back for a second. You're a very smart person who is capable of writing about these issues honestly. I mean, in fact, I told you by email that you had a piece in the New Republic about jihadism. I think it's called The Soul of a Jihadist, that I totally agreed with, right? So that's the mystery I want to attempt to resolve, that you could write an article on jihadism that I could recommend almost without reservation, and yet you could review my dialogue with Maajid so uncharitably that I can honestly say, from my point of view, that you communicated nothing but your own confusion and prejudice. Okay, so my goal here, again, just to be clear, is I want to bridge that gap, essentially between your two articles. But I really think it's not going to be easy because, from my point of view, almost no sentence in your review does what you think it does. Okay, well, what do you think? Did Omer characterize the framing of the conversation accurately, in your view? I made it absolutely clear to him that he could say anything he wanted on my podcast, and I would not edit him. That's an assurance that no journalist ever gives anyone. I simply insisted that he also read every word of his review, so that our listeners, most of whom will not have read the review, could hear the whole thing, and we could discuss its points systematically. I don't know how much clearer I could have been. He could have digressed for 10 minutes over a single sentence if he wanted to. There was no limit to what he could have said. And I also promised, in our email exchange, that if he turned out to be a terrible guest and the podcast was deadly boring, I reserved the right not to release it, which is the decision I felt I had to make in the end. There's another point in the Salon write-up that I want to draw your attention to, and I recommend you read it, because it reveals the kind of person I'm dealing with. Okay, so Omer writes, "What was fascinating about this experiment was how quickly we departed from the rules and had a free-flowing exchange. After a few personality clashes, Harris repeatedly began points with, quote, 'Let me educate you on this,' end quote, before I reproached him for his rudeness. I was his guest, after all. The discussion took on its own logic, swerving as if up a treacherous mountain, speeding forward towards either enlightenment or oblivion. Ideas were exchanged. Veiled insults were delivered." Okay, Mrs. Bronte, I want you to hear Omer reproach me for my rudeness. I think I used this phrase, "let me educate you," twice in the conversation. It was on the topic of the economics of book publishing. And this came after nearly an hour where I couldn't get Omer to admit that Maajid and I hadn't gotten into the Islamic reform racket just for the money. By this point, we had still failed to get past the first paragraph of his review. As you listen to this, please recall how Omer summarized this moment, where I'm the haughty bastard, the terrible host, who needs to get reproached for his rudeness. And please meet Omer Aziz in all his thin-skinned and coddled and microaggression-fearing glory.
You know what you should have done then? If you don't want to create a perception of trying to make money, if you and Maajid don't, go and do a scholarly, serious study of Islam and what needs to be done, rather than a 128-page pamphlet. And this creates the perception of a financial interest, which is just as bad as having a financial interest.
I'll tell you about why the book is short. Why the book is short is because people love short books now. And The reason why there aren't more of them, and again, let me just educate you.
Please do not speak to me in such domineering tones.
No.
Okay, I do not need to be educated. I'm an educated individual.
This is something you can't possibly know because everything you say suggests you don't know it. So let me just tell you, how many books have you published?
Well, soon to be my first.
Okay, well, let me tell you a dirty little secret about why there aren't more short books in publishing. Okay, there are not more short books in publishing because publishers can't figure out how to make a lot of money publishing short books. But they want to publish a 300 or 400 page book and charge you $30 for it. This is the way the costs scale in publishing. And if you publish the 100-page version of a book that really doesn't have to be any longer because it's a very short argument and you would just be padding it to make it longer. And it's actually what people want to read because they can read it in a single sitting and they don't have to decide whether or not they can sacrifice that much time to the book. They can just sit down and read it. Publishing has not solved the problem of how to publish those books. And contrary to what you assume, this is a money-losing move from a publishing point of view. To publish a short book and sell it for $17 or $18 is much worse from a publishing point of view than selling a big $30 book. And that's why more people don't do it. And when Maajid and I write a short book because we think it should be a short book that we want people to absorb in a single sitting, we are pushing against the merely mercenary, merely cynical, merely profit-seeking attitudes in publishing, contrary to what you assume. Okay, well, that was delightful. Do you see why I might not want to give Omer more of a platform or bore you with 4 hours of this? But I will give you one more clip. Okay, Omer writes in Salon the following. Where was Sam Harris's defense of thousands of Muslims and non-Muslims killed by Western bombs? He had never bothered to defend their right to life. Those who had suffered hurricanes of shrapnel for years. Did he not lament those deaths too? In his reply, Harris reduced these people to, quote, collateral damage. And he went off on a tangent about the utility of this term and the Puritan motives of Western policymakers. This is the euphemism Harris repeats quicker than even the most hawkish conservatives do. He does so, I believe, because the Muslim-looking or brown-skinned body is of no human value to him. In one breath, he declared his moral superiority in defending minorities. In the next, he dehumanized thousands of victims and sanitized the victimizers. The corpses of children conveniently hidden behind his two favorite words, Harris could proceed with a clean conscience. And then the editors of Salon interject here. Editor's note, we asked to confirm the wording. Harris said, quote, that's a euphemism. Everyone in the war-making business uses it. It's the jargon term they use, end quote. He insisted that his choice of words did not indicate a lack of care for the victims' lives, end quote. Okay, well, that note from the editor is interesting. So the Salon had an editor for the first time in their history of writing defamatory articles about me. They actually called me to fact-check a few things. And I don't know that they actually corrected any of Omer's lies in response to my answers, but on this point, this quote of mine is clearly calculated to make me seem to be making a crazy claim where, and this is how it's been spun by various critics, that I'm claiming essentially to be in the war-making business myself, right? That's how we in the war-making business talk about these dead people. Okay, I'm going to let you hear the part of the podcast where this comes up and see if Omer has characterized my attitude toward collateral damage accurately, and see if you believe I use this phrase because the Muslim-looking or brown-skinned body is of no human value to me. First of all, I do lament collateral damage. In fact, my discussion
you dehumanize it again. Collateral damage. No. These are individuals, Sam. These are people who have been massacred and maimed.
No, I don't mean to dehumanize with that phrase. I mean, that is, we can talk about that being a problematic phrase, but I'm just referring to the fact that there are people who have been killed in wars, some wars that I think are defensible, some wars that I think are not, right? I mean, there's a difference there. I view the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan differently, but collateral damage is a huge problem in war, and it has been for a very long time. We won what I think everyone views as a necessary war against Germany in World War II, and the level of collateral damage there was just as horrific as ever happened in human history. And now the Germans are our friends, right? So now if you're going to look at the bombing of Dresden, I think in retrospect it was probably indefensible even at the time, and tactically unnecessary. But let's say it was tactically necessary.
Our generals would have been in Nuremberg if we lost that war. Though that was a war crime, as was Hiroshima. So yes, well, I agree with you.
Okay, so no, I think there are reasonable debates on all of these points in terms of, and I think Hiroshima is certainly more debatable than Dresden. But in any case, we waged war against Germany and Japan at a scale that no one could contemplate now, and certainly no one could be sanguine about defending ethically. And now the Germans and the Japanese are our friends, right? I mean, and we went into those societies. We didn't rape and kill everyone and steal all their material wealth and enslave them. No, we went in and rebuilt their societies with them, and now they are our allies. And that is the world. And there's two things to realize about that. One is that it reveals something about the importance of our intentions in waging that war. Our intention was not world conquest. We weren't trying to execute a genocide against Germans and Japanese. And there really is no moral equivalence to the two sides in that war. When you ask what the Germans would have done if they had conquered the world, or the Japanese if they had conquered the world, we would have a very different world we would be living in now. And so even the analogy you drew to Nuremberg there was false. But
yeah, okay, well, look, intentions in foreign policy are actually the most useful and the most irrelevant to analyze an ethical, and the reason why is because you can have great intentions and kill 1 million people, and you can have awful intentions, and it doesn't often turn on the weapon. So yes, World War II is in some cases not a useful analogy today, because all the norms and laws that we've developed internationally since then were a response to that brutality, and we don't want to go back to what it was like bombing Dresden or dropping a nuclear bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
But the deeper issue, there's no way around the deeper issue, which is to wage any kind of war, even a necessary war. It runs the risk of collateral damage, which
these numbers are huge, Sam.
Yes,
for the most sophisticated militaries.
No, but okay,
in fact,
some of these
Israeli generals
some of these numbers are some of that data is highly politicized, and I don't know what the numbers are in certain cases, because, for instance, the U.S. is getting blamed in many of those tallies.
The Pentagon numbers are actually conservative. Okay. If you look at what other impartial investigators look at the casualties in the Iraq War, what you call collateral damage, and just dismiss as if these bodies did not exist.
Okay, look, again, you've just wandered into a totally uncharitable and disingenuous reading of what I said. Collateral damage is a standard phrase that everyone uses on this topic. I'm not diminishing the horror of those who are collaterally damaged, and I've written about this at length, okay? And I don't know anyone who has focused on how bad ethically collateral damage is more than I have. Okay?
But you exonerate by pointing to intentions, and intentions in international relations are irrelevant, Sam.
Okay, is the difference between performing our own rape of non-king on Japan after we've militarily subjugated them and doing what in fact we did, which is helping them rebuild their society, is that difference irrelevant? All right, well, that was fun, wasn't it? Now, many of you might think that if Omer was that bad consistently, surely I was able to expose his irrationality and dishonesty in our conversation. And if so, what's the harm in releasing the whole podcast? And if not, the failure is clearly mine. I mean, then I'm simply covering up my failure to make sense on my own podcast. Well, this might sound reasonable to you until you consider Omer's actual audience. I mean, consider the fact that everyone in Omer's audience, most Salon readers, thought Ben Affleck made perfect sense when I collided with him on Real Time. I can assure you there's nothing I said in my conversation with Omer that will reach these people. Okay, so the question is, should I give Omer, who made no more sense than Ben Affleck, for 4 hours, a platform on my podcast? I don't think so, and I'm certainly not going to be bullied into it by Salon. Now, needless to say, the rest of Omer's summary is filled with self-serving lies. For instance, Omer claims that in this conversation, I quote, dehumanize Muslims to such an extreme degree that it verges upon bloodlust. Just take a moment to consider this. What are the chances that happened? Okay, what are the chances that on my own podcast or anywhere else, I just transformed into Colonel Kurtz? I mean, what are the chances that Glenn Greenwald thinks that happened? He spent about half his day spreading this article around. This is what his first tweet says, spreading this article to 600,000 people. Quote, "Nobody needs to write ever again about Sam Harris and his obsessive cult, because this pretty much covers it all." This is Glenn Greenwald's dance on my grave moment, right? Is there any chance he believes this is an honest portrayal of my conversation with Omer? That I, quote, dehumanized Muslims to such an extreme degree that it verged on bloodlust? Now, the question is the only way to assure you that that didn't happen to release 4 hours of this terrible conversation? No. I'll simply encourage you to read both of Omer's articles on Salon. That's the best he's got. Anyone familiar with my work and who understands it, who knows where I'm coming from, will read those 2 articles and see that this person is dishonest to his core, and he's being published in the perfect place to showcase that dishonesty. And now, as luck would have it, I have a conversation that actually fulfills the goal I was attempting to achieve with Omer. I mean, this is another difficult conversation, or potentially difficult one, where I reached out to a former antagonist and attempted to use my podcast as a forum for salvaging what are otherwise unproductive disagreements, getting them on track and making some progress. And so here I reached out to Jonathan Haidt, who is a professor of ethical leadership at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's a very well-known psychologist. Many of you know his work. And taught at UVA for many years. And he's the author of The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind. He and I have collided with one another on a number of occasions. And this conversation could have gone either way. I was not surprised that it was as successful as it was. But it was a risk, like many of these things are, and this one paid off. So here is what happens when I get an adult on my podcast. We come out of a history of strong and even ad hominem criticism of one another, and we make progress. I now give you John Haidt. Well, I'm here with Jonathan Haidt. John, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Sam. Looking forward to it.
Well, listen, before we get into topics about which we agree, and there are a lot of them, let's start with areas of disagreement, because we've had a few past controversies, which I think our listeners should know about. So many of our listeners will know who you are because you've done extremely influential work in psychology and have covered many topics that are really just of enormous importance outside psychology. But many might not know the history of our bickering in public. So,
right.
So you've been among the prominent critics of the so-called new atheists who have gone after Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Dan Dennett and me.
And you, yes. Yep.
For what we've said about religion, principally. And you spent less time on Hitch because he didn't claim to be representing science. So you've criticized me in the past, and in ways that I thought were pretty wrong-headed, and I pushed back fairly hard against this in ways that, may have bordered on incivility at times. And so the way things were left, I don't think either of us would have tended to see the other as a natural collaborator.
That's right.
So, I find this interesting, just as a social phenomenon. I find it intellectually quite consequential that people stop talking to one another after they have certain collisions in public. And more, I've been attempting to engage people with whom I've had a strong disagreement on important topics, just to see if conversation is possible. And I should just point out to you and to our listeners who will know that this doesn't always work out. I had one podcast that I didn't even release because it went so badly. And I had one that I released recently and probably shouldn't have because it just seemed to do nothing more than increase the sum total of frustration in the universe. It was just people found it excruciating to listen to. And I've had very mixed success doing this in writing. The most memorable failure being that I attempted to engage Noam Chomsky, and that project just fell apart as fast as we could type.
That does not sound promising.
So, but I suspect you and I are up to this. So, we don't need to spend a lot of time rehearsing our past skirmishes, but I just want to, and we can just discover what we disagree about now as the topics come up. But I just want our listeners to know that this history exists, and it was fairly acrimonious. And they should just appreciate that you and I are doing a bit of a high wire act just having this conversation, because most people with our history just actually don't willingly talk to each other in these ways. And so again, my underlying aim is to demonstrate that two people can have a fairly inauspicious beginning and then successfully communicate and make intellectual progress.
Great. I want that too.
Cool.
And actually, in preparing for this call, I was looking back over our past conflicts and, looking at it as a psychologist who studies morality and moral disagreement, I actually think it's kind of revealing the way this all worked. So, initially, as far as I can tell, the first salvo was when I wrote that essay on Edge, very critical of the new atheists. And, I don't think that I was uncivil there, although it was within the bounds of normal Edge conversation. It's, Edge is not a safe zone. I think you and I both agree that intellectual discourse should not be a safe zone. And then you wrote back, and from my point of view, it was when you were saying my ideas would basically, justify or lead to Aztec human sacrifice and all these other horrible things. And okay, that too is within the bounds. All right, so we're sort of up against the edge there, but that's sort of normal. Then, if I remember the timing, it was like right after that we first met face to face at the Beyond Belief conference, and there too. If I remember, I think you said like my beliefs would lead to either North Korea or something like that. And
yeah,
so again,
well, not so. I don't think I would have ever said that it would lead to, but just that you would be hard pressed to say what was wrong with those systems by your lights.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, it may be a distinction without a difference in your mind, but it's a pretty important one.
That is. But the point is just that from the way it felt to me was, no matter what I say, you will link me somehow to North Korea or something like that. I don't think you ever did the Nazis, and I thank you for that. But the point is that I felt that you had a particular rhetorical style, which was well suited for what you were doing. You were writing for a popular audience about a very hot topic, but I felt like, hey, Sam's rhetoric, this is like not academic rhetoric. This is very different, and I don't like it. All right, so that's the backstory. So, but I never really responded. I didn't do anything in writing after that. And then when you wrote a book on morality, in which again you were critical of me in the same way, and again that's fine. But it was like, okay, yet another provocation. I didn't do anything. And then when you came out with the Moral Landscape Challenge, and you were saying, if anyone can convince me to change my mind, I'll pay him $10,000. And that was like too much. It was like, oh my God, this is too much. I've got to respond to this. And so then I wrote the essay, Why Sam Harris is Unlikely to Change His Mind. And for the most part, as I was just reading that over, I think it's a perfectly legitimate statement of my research and how my research leads me to believe that you won't change your mind. So all that's fine. The thing, though, is that clearly was a kind of a jerk move on my part, was, I think, throwing, I analyzed, so for listeners who don't know this story, this debate, I analyzed your books. I analyzed your books and a bunch of other books, and I found that according to this program, Luke, that counts words like always and never in a category of certainty, that you came out as the most certain person, even more so than Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity and all those guys.
Right,
so that was a very jerk thing of me to do. And Sam, I do apologize to you for that. That was inappropriate.
Well, but it did give me a chance to respond to that, which I still am, to pat my own back, I still am amused by my response to that, where I used every one of your keywords in a paragraph, which was on its face, a statement of total intellectual humility and openness to being wrong, but it in fact used all your certainty terms in the same paragraph.
Yep, that's right. And so look, Sam, so in fact, that kind of points to a similarity between us, which is that we both really enjoy being clever. That was my thing was a very clever thing. Your response, where you used all those words, was we were sort of smart Alex. And when smart Alex come up against each other, the audience is in for a treat, I suppose.
Yeah, well, but not to trivialize what we're doing here, because I think these issues are hugely important, and I think our disagreements are important, and I think our misunderstanding one another is important. And just to talk a little bit more about the genesis of this thing, which it occurs to me now, I never really thought about this as we were sparring about these issues, but I think this may be part of the problem, and correct me if this seems crazy, but so your field is social psychology, where you've said that upwards of 95% of people are liberal, and usually strongly liberal. So you've been surrounded by people who consider political conservatism to be a form of mental illness, essentially. And you've pushed back against this in ways that have been extremely important and really ingenious. And you and I are going to agree about many of the points you've raised
the
against
political
liberals.
correctness part. We both have really come up against political correctness, yes.
Yeah. So you've been fighting from that trench for a while. And then when you saw the so-called new atheists, which are just a gang of liberal intellectuals, initiate this frontal assault on religion and arguing that it's not only false but dangerous, and in my case, hearing me say that science will eventually replace religion on questions of morality and human well-being, I think you viewed this as yet another example of left-leaning secularists who are totally out of touch with the lived experience of religious people, doing what left-leaning academics often do to social conservatives, which is dismiss them as morally and intellectually defective.
I think that's right.
Oh, good. Well, that's not crazy. So, forgive me for psychoanalyzing you, but it seems to me that this, from my point of view, has caused you to be too hostile to our criticism of religion and to actually misunderstand it in important ways, and I'm sure we'll touch those points. And it's also made you too soft on religion in ways that can't be scientifically justified. And because you believe you're correcting for a harmful bias in the scientific community, and you have been with respect to the political divide between liberals and conservatives, but I would argue that viewing the new atheist attack on religion through that lens has caused you to misread us. And at the very least, I feel like you've misread me.
I see. Yeah, I don't think that I perceive you guys as a bunch of far left people. So while there is some truth to what you say, I think it's not so much left-right as sort of rationalist intuitionist. That really, I think, is the heart, the sort of the scientific nub of the difference between us is what do we each believe is the nature of human rationality and the reliability of human reason. And you have a much stronger belief that individual reason can lead to reliable conclusions than I do. So would you agree with me that that is a fundamental factual difference between us?
Yeah, and I want to get into morality second. I think we should deal with religion first. But yes, I think that is a difference between us to some degree, although you'll find me taking most of your points about what people descriptively do under the aegis of reasoning morally or attempting to justify or argue for their moral positions. But let's just focus on religion for a second, and we'll get to the foundations of morality after that. So religion, as you've pointed out, is more than just a set of beliefs. And and you've argued against me as though I have disputed that, which I actually haven't. But you're not alone in this. Many people do that. So I just wanted to track through a few of the things you say in your book and then talk about them. So, you say in your book, The Righteous Mind, that this is a quote, trying to understand the persistence and passion of religion by studying beliefs about God is like trying to understand the persistence and passion of college football by studying the movements of the ball. You've got to broaden the inquiry, end quote. So now I think that analogy isn't quite right, but I actually agree with your general point. Religion is obviously more than what people believe, and yet I think it's totally coherent and in fact necessary to worry about the specific consequences of specific beliefs.
Yes.
And so let me just reform your analogy a little bit and get you to react to it. So, because I think it's somewhat, to stick with your analogy, it's a little bit more like asking the question, why are people on each team always tending to run in one direction? So if you see them running sideways or even backwards for a few moments, it's always with the purpose to get the ball to the other end of the field. So what is so special about the ends of the field that everyone wants to get there? And to explain that, you have to understand the rules of the game. In particular, you have to understand what a touchdown is. But once you know that, more or less everything these people are doing is easy to understand. And again, there's more too. There's all the people out, having tailgate parties outside the stadium, right? So that's part of the spectacle. But to understand what the most energized participants are doing in this situation, all you really need to know is what they want and what they believe will get them what they want. And so I would argue that this is true for the most destructive behavior and moral attitudes we see inspired by religion. So when you ask yourself, why is ISIS throwing gay people off of rooftops? It's because their scripture tells them to. It's actually written in the rule book. Now, in this case, it's the specific injunctions in the Hadith, is not in the Quran, but it's part of the larger rule book of Salafi Islam. And I mean, you can say anything you want about religion being more than just beliefs and doctrines, and you can talk about doing and belonging, which you do, in addition to belief, as being central to religion. And you can talk about the power of ritual and strong communities and the importance of transcendence, which is something that interests me. And I agree about all these things being interesting, but if you want to explain the behavior of ISIS, all you really have to know are the rules of the game as they understand them. And if their rule book changed slightly, let's say their rule book on this point said, don't harm homosexuals under any circumstances, simply force them to recite the Quran for 12 hours a day and actually create a special caste of priests that there's homosexuals who just chant from the Quran and who are otherwise venerated, right? I think we can be absolutely sure that this is what they would be doing. In fact, there are analogous behaviors in other religions in human history. So this is why I think specific doctrines matter. And that no one, I mean, so you're going to talk about the intuitive roots of many of these things, but no one has an intuition that they should throw gays off of rooftops specifically, or eat a cracker every Sunday and call it the body of Jesus, or oppose embryonic stem cell research. And in fact, ISIS wouldn't even oppose embryonic stem cell research, and the Catholic Church would. And this is why the specific doctrines matter so much.
Okay, so I will certainly grant that specific doctrines matter, and that I think your thought experiment is correct. If there was a specific verse, and especially if it appeared in multiple places, that said, here's how you treat homosexuals, then they would treat them differently. So I don't deny that the scripture matters. But first, to understand your analogy, you tell me, what is the end zone? What do you think they're all up to? What is the thing they're all striving for to get when you use this end zone analogy?
Well, if you're talking about the real players, the real believers who are devoting their lives fully to this, the end zone is paradise and avoiding hell. So it's what happens after death. It's playing by this rule book, playing this game, advancing the ball down the field, is ensuring that after death you will spend eternity in paradise and escape hell.
Okay, so I think this is one of the differences between us, is that I am opposed to the pursuit of parsimony. I think that the social science, like human nature and the social science, are so complex, and especially if you look at morality or religion. So anytime someone says the goal of religion ultimately is to attain paradise, or the goal of religion ultimately is to have a sense of meaning, or even closer to what I say, if you were to say the goal of religion is ultimately social bonding and connection, well, those are all goals. There are lots of different goals.
In this case, I was talking about ISIS. I was talking about what we would call the extreme committed, death cult of Islam. Now, there's analogous cults in other traditions, but I'm not saying that all religious people in every denomination of every level of commitment, that their main goal is paradise. Some Unitarians don't necessarily even believe in heaven, right? So I was speaking about ISIS in this case.
Okay, yeah. So I can certainly grant your point that beliefs do matter, and I hope I never said that they don't. But I think I would still claim that your analysis here is too focused on the explicit. And this was, my main criticism, my main concern about your writings on religion was I sometimes felt like you were writing, your two religion books. I felt like you were writing those mostly with the Bible and the Quran and the New York Times on your desk. And you were sort of saying, okay, well, look at this verse, or look at this event that happened, and then just trying to make sense of it yourself. And I was thinking of it much more both from a kind of a Durkheimian point of view or a unconscious motives point of view. I mean, there's just so much going on here. And I have not studied ISIS. I don't know what's going on with them. But I don't believe you could understand them by reading the Quran and saying, oh, the Quran says this. This is why ISIS is doing it.
Well,
the motives of humiliation, geopolitical. I don't know what's going on, but there's a lot going on.
But the issue is that this is how they understand themselves. And now here I'm not just speaking about ISIS. I'm just speaking about religious fundamentalists in general. When you ask them how they understand what they're doing, if you ask them why homosexuality is anathema, for instance, they have a scriptural justification for it, and it does explain the belief and subsequent behavior, and where in certain cases nothing else does. I mean, so it might be relatively easy to come up with other non-scriptural reasons to be uncomfortable around the phenomenon of homosexuality. And we can talk about that. I mean, this gets into your kind of moral intuitions, the moral foundations theory. But for many of these things, the only way this idea could ever get into someone's head is based on the tradition and the explicit teaching on a specific point.
Agreed. I agree with you on that point. And so let's make a distinction that I think will be very helpful here, which is between fundamentalism and religion more generally. So if we're talking about fundamentalist movements, then you and I are going to agree much more, including in the moral evaluation of them. And so if we live in a diverse society, if we live in a society, or if we value progress and open debate of ideas and challenging each other and the things we need for the sciences, then fundamentalism is incompatible with all of those things. Christian fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, I would say politically correct fundamentalism or social justice fundamentalism. I think you and I both personally dislike the fundamentalist mindset, I should say. I don't mean the people. I mean the fundamentalist mindset is opposed to values that you and I both hold as individuals and for science. So there, I think there's not as much disagreement between us. But then if you say, what about non-fundamentalist? That's where I think you're much more negative than I am about people who are religious but not fundamentalist. Is that true?
Well, yeah, I'm more negative in the sense that I feel like they make one honest talk about the problem of fundamentalism much more difficult, because they don't want anything too critical said about their holy books or about a tradition of venerating the concept of revelation, right? I think revelation is a problem here. The idea that one of our books was not the product of the human mind, but the product of omniscience, that already just deranges our intellectual and moral discourse really beyond saving, and we have to get out of that part of the religion business. And so that insofar as moderates and liberals do, well, then my only real concern is that, well, I guess there are two more concerns. One is they tend to not be intellectually honest about the process whereby they have become moderate or liberal. So they pretend that there's something in the tradition, in the books, that has been self-purifying. But no, when you go back to the books, they're every bit as theocratic as they always were. What's happened is that they have collided with a wider set of values, secular values and scientific insights and progress, and they have found being doctrinaire and dogmatic is no longer how they want to live. They can no longer justify it, but they're not really honest about just how that winnowing has taken place. And they tend to give credit to the resources of the tradition, whereas really it's the resources of a much larger conversation that human beings have had.
Sure. So if you want to say that people are adopting positions and then searching for a justification and looking for some sort of textual justification for what they've decided to do intuitively, yep, I'm down with that. That's the core of my research, is that that's what a lot of our moral argument and justification is all about.
Yeah. Well, and so you do one. I just want to go back to your book briefly. You do one thing in your book which it's pretty clearly an area where we disagree. I don't think we need to go into it any real depth because it may be a little hard to parse here in a podcast, but I think we should just flag it because it is one. I think it's also one reason why you think I and Richard Dawkins and others have been too hard on religion. And it's this notion that religion has provided an evolutionary benefit to us.
Is it an adaptation or a byproduct? You're right. That is the other core factual or scientific issue that we disagree on.
Right. So I just want to introduce this concept of group selection to those who don't know anything about it, and then we can table it probably. But so you defend this notion of group selection, and specifically the idea that religion has helped certain groups survive, and perhaps a lack of religion has caused others to fail. And you think that this mechanism hasn't just been cultural, but that it's also been biological. And so this idea of group selection, which obviously relates to much more than just religion, this is very controversial in biology. And its main champion, who you do side with here, is someone named David Sloan Wilson, who, interestingly, he's also attacked the new atheists with a level of energy that I never quite understood. So I should just point out that there are many biologists, and I would think still most, as far as I can take the temperature on the whole field, disagree with this idea of group selection. And so if our listeners are interested in it, I think the best summary of the reasons to doubt that group selection occurs was written by our mutual friend Steven Pinker, and the title is The False Allure of Group Selection, and that can be found on edge.org. I know you must be aware of that paper.
So, I responded to it.
So you weren't persuaded by it.
So that is what the debate comes down to, is religion a product of evolution? Is it an adaptation? In which case, that doesn't mean it's still adaptive today, but it would mean that it conferred some benefit. The really exciting idea that so captivated me when I first read Dawkins in college was, wow, what if it's like a virus? What if it's taken advantage of the hardware up there and it's exploiting it for its purposes? And of course, Dawkins and Dennett are really explicit about that. It's a really cool idea, and I used to believe it. And that was the prevailing wisdom. Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, was an incredibly powerful book and a testament to the power of good writing to be persuasive. So the state of the art in the 70s and 80s was, as you say, that most biologists doubted it. In fact, almost all did. Group selection was dismissed because there wasn't any way to solve the free rider problem. If groups were to cooperate for the benefit of the group, any free rider within the group would get extra benefit and the genes for free riding would spread. And so the topic was put aside, and David Sloan Wilson was seen as alone crazy. But a lot has changed since then. So right around that time, the whole idea of major transitions in evolution was being formulated. And there are many other examples of agents that were functioning at an individual level, competing with each other, coming together to be more effective as a group. And even the cells in our body are an example of that. The mitochondria have their own DNA because it was an example of a major transition where multiple entities got together to act as a group. Let's see, what else was there? There's I go through in my book, as though there were four new exhibits, 4 reasons to re-examine the case since the 1970s, gene culture coevolution, things like that. And while it is still true that their biologists mostly seem to side against this. This is actually because I think E.O. Wilson made a big mistake in writing a paper. I love him. I think he's mostly right about things. But I think he made a big mistake in writing a paper saying that kin selection doesn't matter. And I don't understand. I don't think that makes any sense. Kin selection is really powerful. So he took a lot of flack, and people are conflating his rejection of kin selection with his endorsement of groups, or I should say multi-level selection. So just the final point on this is the whole debate since the 60s with Williams and then Dawkins was always looking at altruism. Can we explain altruism as a product of group selection? We are nice to each other because the benefits then to the group outweigh the cost to me as an individual. And my response to Steve Pinker was, well, if you just focus on being nice or altruistic, well, then, yeah, it's kind of hard to argue that this is from group selection. But if you look at the tribalism, that's what really got me. That's why I'm on this side of the debate. If you look at tribalism, how similar it is, how initiation rites all over the world are actually mimicked in fraternity brothers initiations. And I don't think it's because they studied anthropology. It's because there's something in the human mind that makes people, especially young men, want to do things that involve painting their faces or changing their appearance, exposing each other to extreme risk, doing all sorts of things that bond them together as a group, make them quite dangerous, quite able to be predators of other groups. So I think you and I agree on those external costs. So anyway, that's why I'm saying that if you focus on tribalism, you try to understand that, I don't see how you can explain that from individual selection. And this is why I think that the arguments for limited group selection were overwhelmed. That's why I say we're 90% chimp. We're overwhelmingly evolved by individual level selection, in the way that Dawkins describes it. But we have this interesting tribal overlay, and I think that's essential for understanding not just morality and religion, but politics, as we're going to talk about very soon.
Right. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say just a couple of words about why group selection seems spooky from a more traditional evolutionary point of view, and then I'll just get off it because I don't think we'll resolve it here. But I just think, from the point of the criticism, it seems to be a metaphor that gets taken too literally and that blurs the lines between genes and individuals and groups as units of selection. So as you said, group selection is often called multi-level selection.
Yeah, that's the way to think about it.
Right. But, as Steve and others have pointed out, there are many problems with saying that selection acts on groups in the same way that it acts on individuals to maximize their inclusive fitness, or that it acts on them in the same way that it acts on genes, increasing numbers of copies that appear in the next generation. So these things are operating differently, and I'm dogged by the fact that I feel like this is a little too hard to parse in a podcast for people to listen. So
we can skip it. We can just point people. Actually, I think, Chapter 9 of my book. So let's do this. I have made Chapter 9 of The Righteous Mind available for free on my webpage. So if people go to righteousmind.com, they can find my argument for group selection. And if they Google, well, I guess you can direct them but if they basically just Google Edge Pinker false allure of group selection? Is that what
that's Steve's
they
article.
can find that. So that's Steve makes a strong argument against it. So I think we can just pass it off in that way.
Yeah, I mean, so just to crib Steve briefly, the issue is that there's a lot of causality in the world that you don't need natural selection to explain. And so merely having one tribe outcompete another doesn't require natural selection. So like, for instance, if the Nazis had won the war, right, and we were now living in the first century of the 1,000-year Reich, this wouldn't be an example of group selection. I mean, and the difference that would make a difference here is almost certainly cultural and not genetic. So if the Germans had won the war, sequencing Hitler's genome wouldn't tell us why. And yet we would still be living in a world where everyone would now be a Nazi, and the Nazis have succeeded. But here again, so when in talking about success, the success of a group, in this case the Nazis, we're using a metaphor here because this is not analogous to the success we talk about when we talk about genes spreading in a population. Because in this case, the success itself applies to the group, the Nazi Party, enduring for centuries, not to some entity at the end of generations of replicators that have been copying themselves with some rate of mutation and then outcompeting all others. So Steve argues, I think, very strongly that it's a confusion over a metaphor. The interesting thing for me, though, is with group selection, I think it's actually...
I thought we were leaving it.
No, we are. But it's actually a red herring for me because, I'm happy to assume it's true for the sake of argument, right? And it won't actually change any of the things you and I disagree about in this space. Because it seems to me that you draw normative claims from the fact that group selection is a fact. And
very indirectly, yes.
You seem to be saying that even if the tenets of religion are false, right, group selection proves that religion has still been a kind of necessary social glue. And
well, hold on. Wait, let me reword that. So I think, look, you and I are both atheists. We're both naturalists. We both believe that religion is out there in the world. It's part of human nature in some way, shape, or form, and that evolution has to do with the explanation for why it's out there. So we're both naturalists. The question at hand is whether it does something or confers some benefit such that if we could rip it out, we would lose nothing or something. And on Dawkins' view, and I think your view, if we could just get rid of it entirely, we'd be better off. And that might be true. I don't know. But if religion is an adaptation, as I believe it is, then it could still be true that it was necessary for getting us to where we are. And I do believe that religion and the psychology of religion helps explain how we and only we made the transition to living in large-scale societies of non-kin. It could still be the case that it was useful back in tribal days, and now we've supplanted it with law and other things. So I would never say that religion being an adaptation or the truth of multi-level selection would prove anything about how we ought to live today. But what I do draw from it is that seeing it as an adaptation for group solidarity and group coherence makes it easier to see some of the psychological benefits and socio-structural benefits that might be there that are hard to see if you're a secular person on the left. Because that is what I see, is it's really hard to understand what's good about the other side once you're in an argument or debate with them. And from reading scholarship on religion, from reading books, especially the book, James Alt has this wonderful book, Spirit and Flesh, that really helps you see the sociology of a small evangelical community. So that's my only point. I wouldn't say I draw normative implications directly, but I do draw implications for what kinds of lives are happy and satisfying, what kinds of social patterns and structures make people less selfish and more inclined to think about others. And there, I think you just have to think twice if you're going to say religion's just bad and it makes people do bad things, get rid of it.
Yeah, well, so I share your concern for human flourishing and us getting in a position to tune all the dials to maximize it. I guess I was detecting in you some version of the naturalistic fallacy, some version of saying that because this thing is natural to us and in fact selected for and did our ancestors good, that is some argument, some weight on the balance to argue that it is in fact good morally speaking.
Oh, no. I'm only making the argument actually in a way that very much like the way you make in the moral landscape. If we're going to talk about human flourishing, we need a full picture of human psychology, just straight descriptively. So I think you and I differ a little in our descriptive picture of human psychology. But beyond that, it's pretty much a straight flourishing happiness explanation. So I see what you're saying, but I'm pretty sure I'm not making the naturalistic fallacy by saying if it's evolved, therefore it's right or good. I'm not saying that.
Right. So it's just if it's evolved, you would suggest that it could be harder to get rid of if bad, because we've all evolved to think in these ways. But one distinction I still think in this area that divides us, at least it changes the way we tend to talk about this, is there is a distinction in thinking about how science can touch this subject, and the distinction between how we got here, the evolutionary story of just how we came to have the brains and mental capacities we have, and then there's the question of just what is possible given what we are. And that's, for me, those are two distinct and totally interesting and justifiable projects, but they're distinct, and science has a very different role to play in each. And if you're just going to do descriptive science and talk about how we got here, yes, that has no necessary normative implications. And many people stop there and say, well, so science can't tell you how to live. Science can just tell you why it is you find certain things disgusting, why we've, evolved to have very strong in-group, out-group thinking. But, we did not evolve to successfully build a global civil society that's committed to human rights and the free exchange of ideas and racial and gender equality, right? So the question is, can we accomplish this? And, I think we can. But the further question is, would it be moral to accomplish it? And would it be a bad thing if we failed? And I think, yes, we can answer yes on both of those questions. And the crucial point, though, is that success on this front will entail overcoming a fair amount of what we've evolved to care about. So you cite a bunch of work, I remember Putnam and Campbell being some of it, that seems to show that religion is good for people. So in this case, it makes them more generous.
Yes, in the United States, that's right.
Okay.
It doesn't say globally, but yes, in the United States, there's a lot of evidence that religion makes people happier and better citizens, according to Putnam and Campbell. That's right.
And this is the result of their belongingness to a religious community, not their beliefs and doctrines.
That's exactly right.
And this increased generosity isn't just lavished on their in-group, it actually extends to the rest of society, which would surprise many atheists. Now, I don't actually know whether or not this is true. Let's just assume it is all true. It seems to me that even if we accept that as true, it obviously isn't the whole story. I mean, I think we could design a dozen invidious experiments where we show that religious people are more homophobic, say, or sexist than secular people on average, or have a lesser understanding of science or less respect for science. And this would help complete the picture. But I think the problem I have with this line of thinking is that there seems to be a tacit assumption that if we can show that religion is doing something good for people, there is no better way to get those goods that's compatible with a truly rational worldview.
That's a fine point. I agree with that. But let's see. But you raised a question that I think would be great for us to try to work out here. I think we might come to different views. So you said, and I think we both agree that our evolved human nature did not prepare us to live in a giant, global, peaceful, egalitarian society under rule of law. Where, in a sense, we're living above our design constraints, and clearly, to some extent, it's possible because, despite the imperfections, we're sort of doing it nowadays. So our evolutionary past, while it puts on some constraints, they're kind of loose constraints, and we can live in all kinds of ways that we weren't designed for. But here's where I think our different views of religion would lead to different prescriptions for how to do that. So I take part in a lot of discussions. I'm invited to all sorts of sort of lefty meetings about a global society, and the left usually wants. They want that global governance. They want more power vested in the UN. I hear a lot of talk on the left about how countries or national borders are bad things. They're arbitrary. So the left tends to want more of a universal. Just think about the John Lennon song. This is what I always go back to. Just think about Imagine. Imagine there's no religion, no countries, no private property, nothing to kill or die for. Then it would all be peace and harmony. So that is the sort of a far leftist view of what the end state of human evolution or social evolution could be. Now, is that possible, or is it consistent with our evolved nature? Now, here's the other side. The other side, the conservative view, is that we are fundamentally groupish, more parochial creatures, and to have global governance and one giant country or one giant community of all Earth would be a nightmare. It would be chaos. It just wouldn't work. Far better to have authority at the lowest level possible at all times, and build up with nested structures. So a country ends up, for conservatives, a country ends up being a very reasonable, basic building block, and they would not want as much of a global society. They certainly would want international law, they would want treaties, they'd want all sorts of things. So I think this is a case where if you have a kind of a blank slate view or a very positive view that our basic nature is love and cooperation and it's only capitalism that screwed it up, you're going to want a kind of a John Lennon vision of the future, and I don't think that that could really work. Whereas if you start with Edmund Burke, who talks about the little platoons of society, we develop in the family. So conservatives are really, really focused on the family and lower level institutions. And if you focus on making those strong, and then you think about some sort of a legal and social architecture that allows multiple families and communities and states and countries to work together with a minimum of friction, I think that's much more workable. So getting a correct view of our evolutionary heritage and the psychology that resulted from it, I think is very helpful. It doesn't tell us what's right or wrong, but I think it does tell us which way is more likely to work. And if you see us as products of multi-level selection with a deep, deep tribalism, that suggests that you're probably better off going for more the Burke way and having groups that are composed of groups and finding ways for them to work together, rather than the John Lennon way, which is let's erase all group boundaries. Let's erase divisions of nation and everything else and just have one giant planet. I just don't think that's likely to work. I think that is, like as with the communist societies, it's making assumptions about human nature that end up, people just refuse to live that way, and it's a disaster.
One thing about what you said that I want to pull back to the focus on religion is just that you're essentially exposing some of the holes in secular thinking. And I agree those holes are there. In fact, I've written 2 books that attempt to shore up some of the weaknesses I see in secularism. And what you just said relates to this very topical example of the recent migrant crisis in Europe.
Yeah.
Where you have, secular liberals for the most part and, atheists who really can't find a rationale, morally speaking, for anything less than an open borders policy. And in fact, so there's 2 reasons here. There's 2 connections here, because there's this low birth rate in Europe, and many people attribute that to secularism. The loss of religion is really leading to a loss of babies, and that becomes a justification for bringing in immigrants because they need people to work in these societies. So one could argue that for 2 reasons, both economically and morally, secularists are now in a position, someone like Angela Merkel, where they're unable to find a reason to keep the borders closed. And let's just say that this happens, where you have millions upon millions of Muslims who on balance are deeply religious and disposed to have large families. They flood into Europe over the next few decades, and in 100 years, Europe is predominantly Muslim and deeply religious, right? This is a possible counterfactual or actual history. So what lesson should we draw from this? Many people would conclude that what Europeans needed in the year 2016 is more Christianity, right? That only a belief in Jesus and the associated behavior and belongingness that confers, and the fertility rates that get associated with a taboo around contraception, that only that could have protected them from the sweeping changes in their society. And I would just argue is that there must be a truly rational way for secular people just to figure out what sort of world they want to live in and simply build it.
Yep, I totally agree, Sam. And I think this is a nice example for us to talk about, because I think you and I both are wary of mass immigration, but maybe for different reasons. So first of all, the drop in birth rate, apparently the Scandinavians who give a lot of support for women working have at least, they're still below 2 per woman, but it's not as disastrous as in southern Italy where they don't. So you can have a secular society that, if you engineer it right, can still have birth rates that are not much below 2, perhaps. So I wouldn't say that, Europe needs more Christianity in order to have more babies. But I think the demographic issue is really important for the future of any viable society. But I am a Durkheimian. I think Emil Durkheim got it right. I think you have to see communities as absolutely needing a sense of cohesion, trust, shared values, a sense of who we are. And this is why mass immigration can be a bad thing. Now, I'm Jewish. My grandparents came to America in around 1905, 1907, fleeing pogroms. So I look at the videos, I see the kids coming out of Syria, and boy, it's the same thing. So I'm very sympathetic to the moral case. But as a Durkheimian, I think that you can have immigration if you have massive assimilation, which is what my grandparents, or more correctly, my parents then went through. So if you have a society that has the moral resources to say, this is America, welcome, adapt, learn English, you get free education, but you're going to be an American, then you can have mass immigration. And it clearly boosted our creativity, our economy. So, there are many good things about immigration. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, immigration is bad. I'm saying there are many good things about it. But from a Durkheimian perspective, especially Muslim immigration, which is, I think, different from, say, the Mexican immigration that we have. There's no reason to think that Mexicans won't adapt, Mexican immigrants, that their kids won't adapt. But Islam is different. It's more of a binding belief. So to have massive Muslim immigration into secular European societies, where not only do you not have assimilation, you have the left arguing, I don't know if they say the same thing there as they say here, that assimilation is genocide, which is ridiculous. But if you have an anti-assimilationist ethos, then I think Europe is setting itself up for massive failure. Their generous redistributionist welfare states can only work if people have a strong sense of social solidarity. And if you have diversity, diversity is divisive. Again, this is Robert Putnam. He has a wonderful paper called E Pluribus Unum on how diversity is divisive. So I think Europe is in huge, huge trouble because it's very hard to make, given the moral case for mass immigration, they're going to have it. But the sociology is kind of worrisome for what Europe's going to be like, for what these European countries that have high immigration, it's going to be like in 1 or 2 generations.
Yeah. Well, we fully agree on that topic. And I've actually talked the immigration topic to death on my podcast of late. So let's move to morality proper, because this is really where you've made your biggest mark. And it's an area where you and I both agree and disagree. So, as you've already said, you're very skeptical about the power of moral reasoning. And you don't say that we never change our attitude or the attitudes of others through reason, but you insist that we do this far less often than we think or than anyone hopes. You also claim that most of our seemingly rational talk about morality isn't what it appears to be because we reason like lawyers and not really like moral philosophers. So most of our reasoning, and by lawyers you mean that most of our reasoning is really in the service of justifying moral attitudes that we arrived at intuitively. And so we're simply in the business of defending and marketing these intuitions, and not fundamentally getting down to some kind of ethical bedrock. And you move from these observations about the intuitive roots of our moral attitudes and the resulting diversity of opinion morally among people to conclude that science really can't hope to talk in terms of moral truth. Firstly, have I summarized that basic skepticism accurately?
Yes, I would only add that my skepticism is not about reason in general. It's about individual reason, the power of an individual to reason. If you set systems up correctly, and this is what's so brilliant about science, if you set systems up correctly so that you have institutionalized disconfirmation, so that each scientist who's totally motivated to prove himself right goes out there and proves himself right, but then you have others to push back. And this is a reasoned process. We really do make our points not by threat, not by force, not by money. We make them by making arguments. And over time, the system sorts out the better from the worse. So if you think about reason as an emergent property of a system that's set up well, then I'm a big fan of reason. And this is why I'm so upset about the loss of political diversity in the academy. And I guess we'll get to that next.
Yeah.
But this is one of the reasons why the academy has just exploded in craziness, is that it used to simply lean left, and now it's almost 100% left.
Right.
But anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, as for morality, yes, I think that the basic psychology that what we're finding in social and cognitive psychology is motivated reasoning, and we're just not that good at weighing the evidence on both sides. Rather, what we're really good at is we start with a proposition and we ask, must I believe it? Am I forced to believe it? If you don't want to believe it, and then we look for evidence that it's wrong. Or more typically, you start with a proposition, you want to believe it, you search for evidence that it's right, you almost always can find it, and then you stop thinking. So that's why I'm not a big fan of individual reasoning. I think we're kind of like neurons. We're not that smart as individuals, but you put us together in the right way, you get a brain.
Right, but you seem to hold the things we can be right or wrong about in the moral sphere as different from the the facts that science treats.
Correct.
Right.
That's right. That's another fundamental distinction between us. Yes.
Yeah. So just introduce this concept of moral dumbfounding for a second.
So when I started my research in graduate school at Penn and then as an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, originally I thought that reasoning and emotion were both inputs into moral judgment, and either one could dominate. That's kind of a dual process model. And Josh Green is the main proponent of such a model. But I kept failing to find that reasoning would work as I expected it to. And I kept finding that sort of people's gut feelings tended to drive the reasoning. And so I would make up these stories that would pit reasoning about harm versus gut feelings. And so one of the stories was about a brother and sister who are on vacation, from summer vacation from college. They're traveling alone together in France. They staying in a cabin by the beach. They decide one night it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. They use 2 forms of birth control just to be sure. They enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret between them, which makes them feel even closer. What do you think about this? Is that okay for them to do it? And almost everybody says no. And then the experimenter would say, okay, well, why? Tell me why. And at that point, everybody comes up with a reason. Nobody says, well, gosh, I don't know. I can't explain it. Everyone comes up with a reason. But the experimenter would say, well, okay, yeah, true, birth defects, that's a good reason. But, if they're using birth control, like if they could be sure that there's no baby to come, then is it okay? And nobody would say, oh, yeah, sure. If there's no baby, then it's okay. Rather, if you knock down the reason, they say, oh, okay, yeah, well, let me see. Okay, oh, how about this? Yeah. And they come up with the second reason. You knock that down. And after you do this a few times, then eventually people say, gosh, I don't know. I can't explain it. I just feel it's wrong, and I don't know. I can't explain it. So that's moral dumbfounding. And that I took as evidence that gut feelings can support a moral judgment, even in the absence of any articulable reason.
Right. But what I always read you as suggesting there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you move from that fact to suggest that there clearly can be no truth of the matter, right? The fact that people will hold...
Wait. No, I don't think I ever do that. I would not say that the existence of moral dumbfounding tells us nothing about whether or not there's moral truth. You and I disagree about moral truth, but that's unrelated to dumbfounding. That's more of a philosophical argument about the different kinds of things that are true.
Well, that's an implication I wouldn't want you to draw, and if you don't draw it, that's great.
Let's talk about, I'm very fond of this term anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric truths. Should we talk about that?
Well, let me just connect it to another term that people are aware of, moral relativism. Would you consider yourself a moral relativist?
No, but I'm also not a moral realist. So no, I'm not a moral relativist. I think there are moral truths, but they are not the same as the truths of chemistry and physics.
So, and just to get everyone up to speed on what we just said, the idea of moral relativism is, this can mean many different things, and it's a little confusing. I mean, in some ways, even my own view can be called a version of moral relativism, because I believe that there are multiple distinct and yet incompatible possible good lives that people could live, or good societies that could be built. In my book, The Moral Landscape, I say that there are potentially many and even a potentially infinite number of peaks on the moral landscape.
Yep, I like that metaphor and I agree with that argument, yes.
But that doesn't undercut the reality of moral truth, because there are many ways to be off a peak and down in a valley that is purely an area of misery. So the fact that there are many right answers to a question doesn't mean there isn't a difference between a right and wrong answer. But the phrase moral relativism is more usually applied to people who think that just to speak in terms of moral truth is to engage in one or another species of fallacious thinking, that there are no truths that are really true in the sense that things can be scientifically or historically or economically true. And I now recall that one of your mentors was or is Richard Schwader, the anthropologist, and I've actually collided with him both in private and in print briefly on this topic. And he always struck me as a relativist of the latter type. Is that true? And I mean, do you have a difference in your orientation?
Rick is so smart and subtle that almost any category you want to put him in, if you ask him if he fits in it, you won't get a yes or no answer, or the answer will be no. So I don't, I can see why you would call him a relativist. He's some sort. He considers himself a pluralist, and I do too. I consider myself and him a pluralist, and I was very influenced by him on that. So actually, can can I please introduce
Yes,
this
please.
concept, because I think this really clarifies everything for me. Because so philosophers have gone round and round about relativism and realism for a long time. And while I was working with Rick Schwader when I was a postdoc at the University of Chicago, the first thing he had me read just about was an essay by the philosopher David Wiggins, which completely changed my thinking about this, and I've never had a reason to change it since then. Wiggins simply introduces this distinction between different kinds of facts. There are anthropocentric facts, which are true only because of the kinds of creatures we are, and there are non-anthropocentric facts, which are true regardless of the kinds of creatures we are, regardless of whether we ever evolved or existed. So the Earth is the third planet from the sun. If aliens come here, they'll find that. Copper is a better conductor of electricity than aluminum. It doesn't matter if we never invented electricity. That is still true. So the kind of truths that you talk about in the moral landscape, you're mostly focused on truths of the natural sciences. We all agree those are true. Those are true facts. They're true regardless of human participation in them. And the question is, are moral facts the same kinds of facts as those? You say yes, I say no. But that doesn't make me a relativist, because there are many other kinds of facts. So the clearest case for me is facts that emerge because of our interactions with each other. So if I say to you that silver is more valuable than gold, now I'm perfectly free to say I like silver more than gold, but that's not a claim about a fact. But I'm going to tell you right now, Sam, gold is more valuable than silver. That's not my opinion. That's a fact. Now, that's not a fact of the natural sciences. It's not true on other planets. It's an emergent fact because we interact with each other in certain ways.
Well, it's socially constructed. Yes.
No. Social construction means that we attach certain meanings to it, like, cancer is a mark of moral depravity or something. People have thought that was a social construction. This is an emergent truth, and emergent truths can be true even if people don't even know that they're true. So markets can yield prices, and prices can move even if people aren't really aware of the movements of the prices.
Well, yeah, but that's true. But markets are still social construction. I mean, so like money is a social construct.
That's right. Yes. So true. Markets are human creations, but as markets interact, they generate economic facts. Let's take a more challenging one. Should women have equal political rights? We all say yes. Now, is that a fact true across species, that any intelligent creatures, if they have sexual divergence on a different planet, it'll be true for them? Is it true? Is it a fact such that even if we go back 10,000 years ago, in which women almost never had equal political power, they were all wrong, all human societies were wrong until the 1960s? This is a more challenging case, but I would argue this. Given the way we live now, where the basic unit of politics is the individual, there is no good reason, and it would be unethical, to deny women equal political access and political participation. But for thousands of years, people didn't live that way. People lived in which, let's just say in many societies, the family was the basic unit, and there was a division of labor. The man was the political actor. The woman handled more the domestic sphere and gathering, while the man did hunting. So if you just accept that that's the way hunter-gatherers lived, now, can you say that it is a fact that women should have had equal political power? They should have been present at all the political. They were just wrong that they denied that. So I don't think that makes any sense. I think that women's equality is an emergent fact about the way we live now. It is not a fact like chemistry, like copper being a good conductor. What do you think? Do you think women's equality is a fact like the superior conductivity of copper?
Well, not quite. It's certainly a more complicated fact. But here's why I think this bright line between anthropocentric and other truths doesn't get you very far. Because one, my interest in morality extends beyond what is even human. I'm talking about what possible minds there are in this universe. I mean, just what sorts of experiences are there to have given just the nature of consciousness and how it arises in a universe. So if we wind up building conscious computers that can suffer, how can they suffer, and how wrong would it be to build those things? If we can change our brains in the future in such a way as to give ourselves different moral intuitions, right? So not only to live more faithfully by the intuitions we have, but to then ask the question, what intuitions should we have, right? If we could change ourselves into a species of perfectly matched masochists and sadists, would it be wrong to do so? I think those are coherent questions, but they kind of fly the boundaries that you're setting for anthropocentric and other truth claims. And so for me, it's really I view it as the strong claim I want to make about moral truth and its connection to science, and again, science in the most open-ended way. I mean, the science we will be talking about 10,000 years from now, whatever we are, if we're around to talk about anything. The connection is, I mean, you can even forget about the word morality, forget that we've even have this term, forget that we've evolved to the point we have, and just ask yourself, what possible experiences are there in this universe? And that just faces us with a navigation problem. We're at our starting point, wherever we are now or in the future. And if we move one way, we'll become both individually and collectively reliably more miserable, right? If you move far enough in that direction, you can become so miserable that there's just no redeeming quality at all.
Ceteris paribus. Yeah. If you keep everything else constant, more misery is worse than less misery. I'm with you on that.
Right. And then who knows how good human life or beyond human life can be given perfect cooperation, creativity of a sort we can't even currently imagine, technology that has no downside, free energy, everything is powered by starlight, and we just are living in some perfect condition that we may in fact never attain given our, humble apish origins, but is in fact possible for minds differently constituted than our own, right? So we're living in that space, and we're navigating in that space of possibility. And then so when you ask a question like, well, should women be given the vote, or should they live as equals to men politically? Then I think that yes, the moral landscape very likely allows for incompatible, but possibly equally flourishing conditions where in some societies, women, for whatever reason, decide they don't really care about politics and they just want to be the best moms possible. And they have made that choice for reasons in this counterfactual history that are slightly different than our own. And, I could imagine some conditions still of flourishing there that is every bit as good as the one we are attempting to navigate toward. But given where we are and given our history, I would agree with you that obviously having women be the political equals of men is the right thing, and everyone else in our current world committed to some other project there is obviously doing it for reasons that are rationally and ethically indefensible, and creating some rather, again, I'm happy to use these certainty terms, creating rather obvious harms in their own societies, both to the boys and the girls, and the women and the men, and the ultimate case being Afghanistan under the Taliban, or the Islamic State now. I mean, if you look at what life for women and girls is there's
a level
horrible.
Of brutality and exploitation. A society ravaged by war tends not to be one in which you find much humanity, and so the way that women are treated, I'm with you on seeing those societies and the lives for women and men as horrific. But the thing I want to check with you is you talked about consciousness wherever it is. Suppose that there was intelligent life on another planet, we make contact with it. All we know is that it is conscious and it is intelligent. Are you saying that we could say, if we followed out the program of research and thinking in the moral landscape, are you saying that we could say what is right for them? We could actually deduce some moral truths that would apply to them, even if we don't know anything about their evolutionary history. Is that your claim?
This comes down to the difference between answers in practice and answers in principle. So the way I illustrate this always at this point is just to say that there are many scientific questions that are trivially easy to state and have a trivially easy answer, and yet they're perpetually out of reach. In fact, we can't even imagine what would allow us to answer them. And
okay, but
the one here is just how many birds are in flight over the surface of the Earth at this moment.
No, this is a little different, because what I'm saying is, do you think that knowing the evolutionary history is essential for making statements about their morality or not? Is it just the fact that they can experience and they're rational? Is that enough for you that in theory you could derive some moral truths?
Well, yeah, it's totally irrelevant in the sense that you could create a new species now that has no evolutionary history, right? You've just stamped it onto creation, or create the first conscious computer, and it would still be reasonable to ask whether that conscious system was suffering, and if so, how much, or it's happy. Or
granted, suffering is one dimension, but I raise it but what would you say about rights? I think it's something you don't talk a lot about in the moral landscape, if I remember. So think about it this way, and I think Darwin actually even speculated on this, about if suppose we find life on another planet, And suppose we find that it reproduces sexually as we do as individuals, but then we find a different planet where it seems similar, except that they reproduce clonally. So each individual is an exact copy of the other ones within its community or its nation or whatever it is. And I would submit to you that if we know that one species reproduces clonally, we can predict that they would not have notions of individual rights like the one that reproduces sexually. And I don't think that we can say that the one that reproduces, well, they're wrong. They need to get notions of individual rights. They shouldn't be treating their people like that. So my point is that there are anthropocentric truths, and they emerge from the kind of species that it is. And so what is morally true for a species that reproduces clonally by direct copying with exactly the same genome, sort of like the Borg on Star. Well, the Borg's different, but facts about the origin, facts about can tell you facts about the psychology, facts about the psychology can tell you whether certain whole categories of moral truths, such as rights, are relevant or not.
Again, this comes down to the different projects in science, one being descriptive and one being normative. And so descriptively, yes, knowing a creature's evolutionary history will tell you a lot about what it's likely to want, what it's likely to find to be a source of suffering, what it's likely to think is morally salient in the sense that what is relevant in regulating its social attitudes and behavior with other creatures in its environment and conspecific. So it's morality emerges in once you have more than one sentient being. So if you're alone on an island, I don't think morality is a problem, but well-being is still a problem. So our moral concerns are a subset of a deeper concern about well-being. And
well, that's your definition.
Yes.
On your definition, that's right. Everything's consistent, and we have different definitions of morality.
Perhaps we should go there. I think it's. I don't know if I fully answered your question. I think the history is actually irrelevant moving forward toward answering the question of what will maximize the possible well-being of you and those around you given what you are. We have to leave the monkey behind in our case in so many ways. We have to get rid of tribal violence. We have to get rid of our disgust circuitry that misfires in all sorts of ways, that leading us to condemn people for things that shouldn't be considered moral infractions. We have an understandable set point emotionally and physiologically on various topics based on evolution, but we're in the process of rejecting many of those levels, and that's
morality evolves culturally,
and morality consists in our finding our way through that maze toward a circumstance where more and more people flourish. Right. So
that's your conception of morality, and that's all coherent and consistent.
Tell me how it's not yours. So if I told you there's one way you can live that's going to get you everything you want in life, but it's going to come at a massive cost to some little girl somewhere who's going to be made miserable by it, or there's another way you can live that's just as good as the first. You're going to get everything you want in life.
That's fine. I agree with you.
But the little girl's also going to flourish. So you're committed to more general flourishing as well. Right.
As I said, ceteris paribus, more flourishing is better than less. It's just a question of whether this is all there is the experiences, and we add up the experiences. And as I said in one of my replies to you, the view you're taking is kind of like Dan Kahneman's early work on happiness, where he thought that you add up the total moments of happiness, and whatever life has more of those moments is the better one. But he changed his mind, and one of the reasons is because while our experience of suffering and flourishing is important, there are other elements, and a big part of it is the story we tell about ourselves, our sense of meaning. It isn't just the total number of moments. And I always do this with my students. I ask them, which life would you rather have? One in which the total, and I draw out graphs, one in which the total amount of happy moments or pleasure is 50% more over the life, which is huge. But in the last 10 or 20 years, the story you have about your life is that you were an utter failure. So it's our sense of meaning, our sense of narrative. There's more to a happy life than moments of flourishing. And this is why I don't think you could measure with an fMRI scan or any other tool. You can't just measure the amount of happiness or pleasure, add it up, and say this life is better than that.
Actually, that's a good point, because I argued with Danny Kahneman about this over a dinner Unfortunately, this wasn't public. This was just private argument, but it was a very interesting conversation because I pressed him on precisely this point. The terminology he was using at that point was the experienced self and the remembered self.
Yeah, right.
And so the remembered self is this retrospective look. So if you were just going to sample someone's experience moment by moment and you stick in your well-being detector and just see how happy they were, that would be the experienced self moment by moment. But the remembered self is when you ask them, how good is your life? How happy are you? How actualized are you? How do you feel about your future? Then you get these broader answers that, summarize the last year of their life or so.
Right. But I'm talking about something even beyond that, because even that is still just about happiness. How much happiness do you remember that you had? I'm saying there are levels of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of accomplishment. There's things beyond just how much happiness you remember.
Right. Sure. And we can bundle all of that into this remembered self, right? Remembered self is the only one you can talk to. His point is that whenever you ask someone how happy you are, they are always giving you the remembered self's version of it. And so when you talk to people, they talk about, again, and I fully agree, they talk about more than just moment-to-moment pleasure. They're not aspiring to be successful heroin addicts. They want more out of life. They want a sense of meaning. They want connections. They want a story that they can tell about themselves. All of it, right? And some of those things that they achieve come at the expense of an obvious diminishment in moment-to-moment pleasure, right? So people will go through ordeals to get to what this thing that they think they want.
That makes a good story.
So I still think the area under the curve is the final answer here. It's just that you have to be clear about what's under the curve. So
okay. Hey, can I suggest, actually, given that we're going to run out of time, I have office hours coming up, and I think the campus political correctness and political correctness in general is something you and I care a lot about. And I think I saw on Twitter a lot of your listeners were asked that we talk about it. So I'm just going to suggest that, given that we're running out of time, we move on to that.
Okay, well, let's table that. But I would just say to you that there's more than what you or Danny have said on that topic, and we can talk about it at some other point. So what the hell is going on politically? And you've pointed this out in many different ways in the past. There's a level of, there are different blind spots on the left and right, politically and morally. And the conversation between the two, or lack thereof, plays out in really bewildering ways at this point. So give me your thinking at the moment on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I've been extremely alarmed by the way campus culture at a lot of our top schools has changed radically just in the last 2 years. There are these new ideas about safety, and I hear undergraduates often saying things like they just take it for granted that a classroom is supposed to be a safe space. Now, if they mean that the teacher shouldn't insult people or people shouldn't hit each other, of course. But what they mean is that people should not be exposed to ideas that might make them feel marginalized or demeaned. For example, if somebody were to question affirmative action, that could be threatening to students who might have benefited from affirmative action. Therefore, you can't question it. And it's very strange that people are getting in trouble. And I was dragged before the Equal Opportunity Commission for showing a video that in class that one student objected to one word that a student said in it. All this weird. What
was the word?
Disgusting. So it was in the context of a discussion about the dumbfounding scenario, actually. And it was a conversation between two UVA undergraduates, and one of them he's cross-examining the other one. The experimenter cross-examines the other one, and the guy ultimately says, well, I don't know, I can't explain why it's wrong. Well, I guess I just, I have a sister myself, and I would just find it disgusting to watch, to think about having sex with her. So the experimenter follows the script, which is, because people often say something like that. And so the experimenter says, well, okay, you'd find it disgusting, but does that make it wrong? I mean, personally, like if I were to see two men having sex, like I personally would find that disgusting. I wouldn't want to watch it. But, that doesn't make it wrong. I mean, if people are inclined that way, they have every right to do it. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay, so, I've shown this video 50 times. But by the time class was over, a student had emailed the dean to complain about my homophobia. I thought she must have just missed the part. She must have misunderstood the video. I mean, I said, well, come talk to me tomorrow. Let's look at the video. You'll see he's not condemning homosexuality. He's actually pro-gay rights. But she engineered. Basically, she brought the class to a standstill. She demanded that I apologize, and finally, she bullied me into apologizing. And finally, I did, just because I had to keep the class going. And this was because it was an intensive class every day for a week. So I apologized, but she didn't like the apology, so she brought me in front of the Equal Opportunity Commission. And there was no way that they were going to convict me.
And this is at UVA?
No, this is at NYU. But the point is, it took like about a month out of my life. And during that time, she she had other people mount a social media campaign, writing things about how homophobic I am. So it was really a nightmare. And I was so like, what the hell is going on? Like, where is it? It just didn't make any sense. I mean, I've been parts of groups pushing for gay rights. My research is on disgust. Actually, I have a paper showing how you can reduce prejudice against gay people. So I felt like, my intentions are all in the right place. I didn't say anything. What's going on? And then other things similar to that happened to me and then began happening to lots of other people. And this is in the 2013 to 2014 academic years when this all begins to happen. The campus disinvitations, the words trigger warning and safe space, they barely exist before 2012. But by 2014, they're everywhere. And this is why when Greg Lukianoff, who is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, when he came to me in the summer of 2014 with his diagnosis that, John, this weirdness going on campus, it's exactly the errors that I learned about in cognitive therapy. Like campus is teaching undergraduates to think in the exact distorted ways that cognitive therapy teaches you not to do, like catastrophizing, mind reading, all those sorts of things. And so I was so busy. I was saying no to everything. But when Greg came to me after my own experiences, I said, "Oh my God, Greg, this is brilliant. This is what's going on." So that's what led to he and I writing this article that was published in The Atlantic last August. And it was, we had no idea campuses were going to melt down beginning at Halloween at Yale, Missouri, so many other schools. So a very strange thing is happening, and I think it's so interesting. I mean, it's horrible because it basically has put a chill on free speech. Everyone is afraid of saying anything that will set off the most sensitive student in the class. Professors all over the country are scrubbing their syllabi clean. We're not showing videos that could provoke. We're not saying things. So education is taking a nosedive in this country because everyone's afraid of a big social media storm or being charged with marginalizing or whatever it is. So this is what's happening, and
this is purely a liberal phenomenon, right? Is there a conservative analog to this, or is this just
a little bit? Yeah. So what happens? So there's a wonderful paper on the origin of microaggressions. In fact, if listeners just Google where microaggressions really come from, I wrote a summary of this article, and what these authors, Manning and Campbell, two sociologists, what they point out is that microaggressions, the idea that, like, if I ask an Asian student, "Where are you from?" that's a microaggression because I'm implying that he or she is not American. The idea that this is an act of aggression is an odd idea, but the whole culture of microaggressions, they point out, only emerges in places that are very, very egalitarian, meaning, so that'll be on the left, and also that have administrative bodies that will punish opponents. So it's the very presence of all the diversity committees, all the ways you can punish people for saying things you don't like. This is why the most progressive places in America, like Yale, Amherst, Brown, the schools that are erupting in riots are the most progressive left-leaning places. And it's because the whole idea of seeing everything as a microaggression only flourishes in those places. But to answer your question, once you get this dialogue of, "I've been traumatized, I've been offended against, you've committed violence against me." Once you get people on the left saying that about everything, the few people on the right, and there's often a minority, I mean, there are some conservatives at Yale, Brown, and Amherst, they then start using that language too. So you do see occasional examples of people on the right claiming that they've been traumatized or microaggressed. But it is mostly a left. It mostly comes from the social justice left.
This is a recent phenomenon, but this seems to be of a piece with something that isn't so recent. So, like, for instance, these no-go areas in science, these taboo topics like racial and gender differences in intelligence, the bell curve wars, and, Larry Summers getting into hot water at Harvard. And I think you wrote about this some years ago in an Edge piece. You speculated that mapping the genome is going to open up a much larger front in this war of controversial topics. So, have you thought any more about that? I can imagine that this is only making it that much more difficult to touch any of these areas scientifically if you can't even talk about them in front of your classroom.
That's right. So political correctness is not new. Even back in the 60s, there were all kinds of things you could not say. There was a big wave of it in the early 1990s and hate speech codes, all that sort of stuff. What's new is the idea that students or people, but especially students, are so fragile that if they're exposed to something that is an offensive idea, they will be traumatized, they will be damaged. And that wasn't there in the 90s. In the 90s, the idea was this is an incredible injustice, you're a bad person for saying this, you're a bad person for studying this, but there wasn't the idea that, oh, you've traumatized people, you've damaged people. So that's new, the idea of fragility. And this grows out. I've learned a lot since Lukianoff and I wrote the Atlantic article. This ultimately seems to grow out of the massive changes in child rearing that happened in the United States after the early 1980s. So if you were born before about 1975, then you had a childhood like people all over the world have always had, which is that you spent a lot of time without adult supervision. And sometimes you got in fights, sometimes you got lost, sometimes you got scared, and you'd figure it out yourself. But we had a real crime wave beginning in the 70s, and there were several high-profile abductions, especially Eitan Pate's, 3 blocks south of where I'm sitting right now in Greenwich. Yeah. And right around the time of Eitan Pate's, just after that, we get cable TV. And once we get cable TV, we have constant 24-hour coverage of every child abduction. So even though pretty much nobody abducts children other than the non-custodial parent, Americans came to fear that if they ever had kids unsupervised, those kids would be abducted. It is literally illegal to let your 8-year-old walk to a park 2 blocks away. You can be arrested for doing that. So parents don't do that. Kids are never without adult supervision until they're mid-teens in many cases. And so what happens is students get to college and they have not had a chance to really deal with setbacks and even insults on their own. There's always been some authority that they should appeal to. So they get to college and somebody says something. Maybe somebody criticizes affirmative action, and that hurts. They don't like it. So what do? They have this whole ideology built for them. They might even have encountered it before college that says that they are a victim of microaggression. Somebody, perhaps a professor, although professors are always on the left, so it might not have been, it's probably more a student. Most of the complaints are actually about students. So some student said something and it hurts. And so you don't say something back, you go straight to the dean or the diversity administrator. You file charges. So this is what's new. This didn't happen 10 or 15 years ago. This is just the last couple of years. They call it accountability. They say we need to hold professors accountable for what they say. But when everybody in the class is holding the professor accountable for not making them feel bad, I mean, it's like being back in, communist Romania or East Germany. You're speaking to the Politburo, and if you say anything out of line, you're in big trouble.
What explains the fact that the adults are caving into this? You've just explained why the kids are coming in like this, but why does the administration yield to this pressure?
Because they have painted themselves into a corner. So two things that have happened. One, there's been rising political polarization in the country. Left and right really, really dislike each other more now than they did 20 years ago. So everybody's more politicized, and the administrators and the professors are almost all on the left now. They used to only be about 70 or 80% on the left, or whatever. It used to be 2 to 1 left to right. Now it's about between 5 and 10 to 1 left to right. So you have everybody's increasingly polarized. Everybody's on board with fighting conservatives. Conservatives are bad. There's a kind of a new religion. In fact, linking back to everything we talked about before, our religious minds have created a new religion of social justice. On campus, the religion is social justice. The most sacred thing in the world is the victim, especially the African-American victim. We have blasphemy laws. If someone questions affirmative action, that's blasphemy. It is literally defined as a microaggression to question affirmative action. Eric Posner, son of Richard Posner, associated questioning affirmative action with Holocaust denial. So there are blasphemy laws now. So it's become a religion. And so once this religion of social justice has taken root in the humanities and increasingly the social sciences, now the presidents of the universities, faced with demands from students, cannot say no. They cannot say, in fact, maybe you do need to toughen up. Maybe you just need to, sometimes students are going to say things to you. Maybe some of them are even racist, but, we can't have a committee prosecuting every time someone says something offensive. They can't say that. So what they have to do is they have to say, you're right. As the president of Yale said, we have failed you. So the students give him an ultimatum. They say, President Salovey, we demand that you do these things. You must respond by Wednesday. Now, if you're the president of the university, what should you do? Should you respond by Wednesday? But he has to. Or rather, I shouldn't say he has to. He chose to. And so all over the country, presidents are caving, they're giving in, they're validating this victim narrative, and they're promising to do things like more microaggression training, more diversity training, which are going to make things worse. I've been reviewing the literature on this. Diversity training, especially if it's done in a vindictive way, backfires. So it's a disaster. What's going on campus is a disaster.
I'm not on a campus, so I really just have to ask people like you. But my perception of this problem, just reading articles like your own and seeing people push back against it, as you are doing here and as you did in your article, I guess I've been too sanguine about this. My sense was that this problem must be, if not on the verge, at least it's in the process of being pushed back, right? You seem to be saying that it's going to get a lot worse.
What people don't understand, if you're not on a college campus now, if you graduated before 2013, you have no idea what's going on, because this only emerged in 2013, 2014 at a few places, and then it spread. Now, last fall is when it spread. So we're now living in a world of social media where ideas can spread so fast that would have taken years before. So if you graduated before 2013, you haven't seen this stuff.
It kind of has the character of what we often call a moral panic.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. It's a moral panic, but it only makes sense given the new religion of social justice. Social justice has become the religion of the humanities and parts of the social sciences, not the natural science. The natural sciences still work like real sciences.
Right. I've been noticing the problems in liberalism of late, and I've called myself a liberal for as long as I've had any political identity at all, and I reliably align with liberal principles on, I check almost every box except once we start talking about things like the clash of civilizations and the problem with political Islam, and then all of a sudden I sound, or at least I'm attacked as something more like a conservative on those topics. But I don't even know why I still call myself a liberal, given how endemic this confusion is in liberalism. And there's something, you don't call yourself a liberal anymore. You're a centrist, right? That's right.
But there's two things going on. So America screwed up the word liberal. We have no idea what it means. So liberal, just read John Stuart Mill, classical ideas about creating space in which individuals can be free to pursue their life projects. You can't tell me what to do. I can't tell you what to do unless you're hurting me. And here we don't mean hurting my feelings in an indirect way. Unless you're interfering with my life project or hurting me, you can't tell me what to do. So that's liberal. In that sense, you're liberal, I'm liberal. Almost everybody on campus is liberal. Most conservatives are liberal.
Yeah, well, libertarians answer to that description. Yeah.
So that's the word liberal. And in Europe, that's still what it means. We in America began equating liberal with left, and that's a mistake. So I was always on the left, and I think you're saying that you were and are still on the left. As a result of writing The Righteous Mind, I have moved to the center. I'm no longer on the left. I've never voted for Republican, and boy, it's not looking like I'm going to this year either. But I'm no longer on the left. But what's really going on, I think you put your finger on it, is illiberalism. So everybody, all the faculty they call themselves liberal. They're on the left. But there's a huge difference between the illiberal left and the liberal left. The illiberal left is saying, you can't use that word. You have to use this word. You can't wear that clothing. That's cultural appropriation. You must do this. We get to dictate how everybody lives on campus. That is what is happening. And this is emerging not from the faculty on the left. This is emerging from the students, the illiberal left. It's a small group. It's not most of the students. But the liberal left is afraid to stand up to them, because if you stand up to them, you're racist, you're sexist. So all over, on many campuses, I hear this from so many students and faculty. Somebody will say something outrageous. Many people in the room think, oh my God, that's crazy. But nobody has the guts to stand up because they're afraid of being called racist. But look, any virtue carried to extreme becomes a vice. So egalitarianism carried to extreme, as happened under Mao, says, the people, there's the good class and the bad class, is what Mao said. If you're poor, if you're a peasant, you're the good class. If you owned a business, if you're wealthy, you're the bad class. Basically, what we see on campus now with the ideology of privilege, they're the good people and the bad people. The bad people are those who are privileged, which is all white people, all men, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a rabid egalitarianism that I think has become bad. But the other thing, and this is what's new just recently, is the inclusiveness. So inclusiveness is a good thing. We do need to take affirmative steps to make sure we're not inadvertently marginalizing or alienating African Americans, Latin Americans. So inclusivity is a good thing, but carried to extreme, it becomes bad. And what's happened is in this new religion of social justice, the central virtues are inclusivity and equality. And if anyone in the 7 marginalized groups feels excluded, that trumps everything else. And this is where it becomes bad, and this is where it becomes impossible to have a university, because now we can't I can't say something. I can't present a scientific theory. I can't present, if we're going to talk about why are women underrepresented in the STEM fields, and if a professor were to say, well, actually, prenatal testosterone actually influences what children enjoy doing, might that be relevant? You can't say that. I mean, I just said it, but a professor on the left can't say that.
So you literally, if you were teaching that subject area, you would feel that you actually had to drop that fact from the lecture?
Me personally, I would be very hesitant to say that at NYU, not that NYU is particularly bad, but because that's where they could file charges against me. But if I'm not at NYU, I'm free to say it because students at other schools can't really do much to me. But yes, students, I've heard from many professors, they are simply avoiding controversy because it's just not worth the trouble. It can take months of your life.
That's incredible.
But again, the point is that once you make inclusion a sacred value, that means no trade-offs. That means there's 7 marginalized groups. So it's African Americans, women, and gay people, LGBTQ. That's the 3 big ones. Then there's Latinos, Native Americans, disabled or mentally ill. So those are, and that's 6. That's where we were for the last 10 or 20 years. But just in the last year, now it's Muslims. Muslims are the 7th. So if you say anything that criticizes Islam, or that would any way make Muslim students feel uncomfortable, that's racism, that's homophobia. So so professors are going to be very, very careful from here on in about saying anything critical of Islam.
Interesting. Well, I guess I can claim to have done my part on that particular front.
Yeah, good thing you're not a professor.
Yes. So what do you make of our current political landscape? What's now we are talking at the beginning of March, and Donald Trump seems to be virtually guaranteed to be the Republican candidate, and it seems probably it's also going to be Clinton against him. How do you view our future?
Well, I'm extremely alarmed because I've been tracking the rising polarization for a long time, and it's been growing steadily since the 90s, the degree to which we dislike the other side. But we're at an inflection point this year. So even if at one point people thought, well, what if it's Trump versus Sanders? Even if it's going to be Trump versus Clinton, well, each side. So people on the left are much more incredulous about the right that they could have nominated Trump. People on the right are absolutely incredulous that people on the left could have considered nominating a socialist to run the country. So I'm extremely alarmed, not just by the things that Trump says, by the belligerence, the risks that I think he'll expose our country to. And also, let me say, while I think Hillary Clinton is can do the job, and I probably will end up voting for her because I don't see any alternative, I don't like a lot of what she stands for. And she is actually going to be really bad on free speech issues. She is going to double down on the idea that there's a rape culture, which is, there's not, this is a whole nother story, but there's a hookup culture. And because of concept creep, we define everything down. But Hillary Clinton is going to make it even harder to have free speech on campus because she's going to even toughen the laws on what counts as harassment and marginalization, all that stuff. So I'm very upset about our choices, but I'm really concerned about our country because the degree to which we dislike and distrust the other side, it's already made it very hard to have compromise, and Congress, many of them feel if they compromise, they'll really get in trouble from their district. They'll get primaried. It's going to get 3 times worse now. So I'm very alarmed for the state of our democracy.
Yeah, I ran a poll on Twitter which alarmed me. Obviously, this is just a poll of my audience and random people who happen to get forwarded it. So it's not the general population, and it definitely skews liberal. But what it suggested to me is that there are many Sanders supporters who hate Clinton so much and whose basic platform is just rejecting traditional politics that some significant number of them either will not vote or will vote for Trump.
I don't think that's true. If you go back to 2008, I was one of those people. I really liked Barack Obama, and I really disliked Clinton. And I thought for a while, if Clinton gets the nomination, I would vote for McCain. And that's the way a lot of people felt back then. But once the election comes around. So there's the Bedouin proverb, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother, and cousin against the stranger. But almost all of them, if it's Clinton versus Trump, almost all of them are going to vote for Clinton. That's my prediction. Yeah,
well, I hope so, because it looks like it's going that direction. And I think I have all of your reservations, I'm sure, about Clinton, but at least she seems like a grown-up who can do the job and not run civilization off a cliff.
That's right.
So Fingers crossed, John.
Well, we do live in interesting times, and you and I are studying the central core of what makes things so interesting, I suppose.
Yeah, well, listen, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I'm very glad we got a chance to talk and break our uncomfortable silence.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this, Sam. I really appreciate you reaching out and inviting me on. Thank you. So I look forward to seeing you at a future conference.
Yeah. Until next time. If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast. Or you can support it directly. And there are two ways you can do this. You can leave a donation through my website at samharris.org/donate. Or you can try a membership at Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks, at audibletrial.com/Sam Harris.